6, 7, 8, 9, and 5 of us here. I'll call this meeting to order based on quorum. Let's say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Be seated. Special note to speak into the microphone tonight. You have a little packet there. Christina sent in the minutes, and we just got these today. And if everybody has the minutes, they're brief and abridged. There's side 2. I'm going to take a minute here just to run through them.
And Dave, I want to note that we've got our since Christina's not here to take notes, I got my recorder on taking notes for us, and then we'll share with her.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay, we had a workshop presentation. Wait a minute for Sandy. All right, based on what we've read, do I hear a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Do I hear a second? Any discussion? Any omissions, corrections? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Minutes pass.
I just have one quick question
Sure,
about the
absolutely.
vision statement. Where do I see where that is now? What does it say? It says, like there's no formal update, but what, I know there's been some changes made to it, but where is it? Is it?
So there's a draft.
Where's it at?
That is in SE Group. And,
Okay.
and they're,
If I ask, I guess you can send it now.
yeah, and it might be captured, something we might have.
Okay, I
Absolutely,
didn't want to interrupt, I just.
No,
wanted to ask.
and actually, we're gonna get to, where we're at with a lot of this,
Okay.
There is something on the website.
I was going to
Yeah.
say, I thought at one point there was a version that was up on the website,
Yeah.
and it will go into the document. So
Yeah.
Sandy, you're right to ask for it.
Yeah,
and,
no, absolutely.
see the current version.
Okay.
But, yeah.
So we had what I wanted to discuss today was reviewing where we're at with the consultants and have a discussion based on a submittal from East Tennessee Development District and some conversations with SE Group. So I'm going to kick it off here just to start the conversation because I feel we need some input from everybody in the committee. Last month on May 1st, I sent an email out to all of CPAC, to East Tennessee Development District, Kim and Ida for SE Group, the mayor, et cetera. A lot of people involved here and the whole committee for sure. To all, CPAC will be utilizing our May date to implement the historical preservation workshop led by ETDD. We will also ask our consultants at ETDD by copy of this email to submit a rough draft copy of the deliverable by June 17th at the CPAC meeting. We will then submit to the planning commissioners and mayor for their review. I am excited that we have this opportunity to be a part of the historical time in Townsend's development. As we wind down, I want to praise CPAC members for being diligent in their work ethic. That was May 1st. This is the deliverable, the only one I got. Somebody needs you, Sandy.
Sorry, I can't talk, I'm in a meeting.
And it's in your packet, and there might have been some misunderstanding maybe on my part. When I sent that email out, I was looking for a complete collected document, the whole document, however many pages it is. And I think we just got a chapter here. That's what we have. Cool. So, on my part, I don't know if it's a communication breakdown or a lack of having better communication, or Mayor, do you have some input on this? Have you had any conversations with ETDD?
Yeah, I think here, my understanding, I did have a conversation with the Kim at ETDD, and this contract is sort of shared between SE Group and East Tennessee Development District. East Tennessee Development District is in charge of delivering the updated draft of the land use and transportation plan. And so ETDD is working to deliver this by September. Maybe August, but September, because that's what they understood that their timeline was going to be. Now, SE Group was in charge of doing a lot of the community engagement, and they are also in charge of doing the Parks and Rec master plan. And so they got finished with their, a big chunk of their community engagement, and so they were starting to run up against the number of hours that they had allotted in their contract. And so ETDD has had to slow down a little bit. SE Group has had to slow down a little bit while we wait on ETDD to sort of catch up with the document. So I think it's just sort of something we run into in our project management. But at the same time, I was hoping that we'd have this whole thing wrapped up by the end of the summer, by early fall. So what will happen is once all the pieces of the contracts are put together, we will have an updated land use and transportation plan that follows the same basic template. So that's what the Planning Commission told us to do. Don't go out and write a new document, but update the current document that we have. And in addition to this, we will have a Parks and Rec master plan. And so both of those documents will have to be reviewed and recommended by the CPAC to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission is actually the one that's responsible for approving this. So y'all, Sandy, might have been involved in this, when it got done before. But planning, the land use transportation plan is the responsibility of the Planning Commission. Once it's approved by the Planning Commission, then it is essentially done. It will go to the Board of Commissioners for an endorsement. But my guess is as we're sequencing these documents, we would send, some draft to the Board of Commissioners. Dave comes most every time, Houston comes to update the Board of Commissioners on what's happening with the community plan. Because they need to see it. If they've got questions or things, they will want to be able to provide their input rather than sort of getting a finished product, dumped in their lap by the Planning Commission. But ultimately, it's the Planning Commission that's responsible for this, and it leaves the advisory committee as a finished product. So it doesn't go to the Planning Commission without your recommendation of the finished product. And so I think we're still hoping to bring it all together by late summer, early fall, but we're going to have to, get the additional chapters from ETDD. And I think, Dave, in your message, you were hoping they might have been a little further along, but what we've determined is that they're they're still, I mean, they only just had their last workshop on history and preservation of wildlife.
I think in my vision was to have that completed version, the last version, and then seeing new chapters kind of taken over. So we have, right now, we don't have a way to compare, to look at the last document and compare it to the new document. We're just kind of going blind on this for the most part. So that's one thing. If we're going to recommend that, I feel that the committee as a whole will need almost a workshop in itself just to go through the previous document to see what needs to be upgraded or compared, at least where we're at. So
Yeah, I think that's right. I would like to spend a little time, just based on this chapter that we got, and we all have had a chance to take a look at it now, talk about the format, because one of the things that DTDD has proposed is a pretty significant departure from the way the current document is organized. And so what I mean by that, they have proposed to have the recommendations sort of built into each chapter. Now, when I mentioned this to them, the response that I got is this is, a modern, effective way of doing this, but it's not the way that, we asked them to do it. So we need to, I'd like to get your thoughts about what that format looks like, because typically the way this document is organized, and I've seen others that follow this format, is all the recommendations are grouped together in one section. So you've got the upfront chapters we've talked about that have all the data and information. And then you have this chapter 5 and 6, let's see. One of them is the chapter 5 is the development plan. So this is where you have all the land use policies. If it says we're going to have a quarter management plan or something like that, that would be a policy here. And then the implementation, section 6, is how do you go about doing it. And what they've done is they've started to build in this, the chapter 5 parts here as the strategy, and chapter 6, or the section 6 recommendations, sort of building it into these chapters. And so I would want to have some discussion about how y'all feel about that, because if we want them to go back to this, which is what they were asked to do, then we need to tell them so that they can organize it like this.
well, and therein lies, like I say, maybe it's misunderstanding or communication. If we're asking them to do a job in a particular format and they're doing it in a different format without knowledge of us, then that puts work on us to completely redo the way we're thinking. So I don't think that the CPAC committee is under contract with the city to do that. I believe East Tennessee Development District is. So I would be in support of contacting them and having them correct this document.
Yeah, we can ask them to put it back in the other format. That's what we asked for in the beginning. But
Absolutely.
it is kind of interesting to see how it looks, here in this format. I think there's pros and cons of doing it both ways. I, looked at what they wrote here, and it's a little more relevant. But then it's harder for me to find it. If I'm the planning commissioner, I just want to go to the section on, what are those land use policies and see which one I need to look at. And then I can go over to the implementation and see, does this go to the Board of Commissioners? Does it go to the Planning Commission? Is it something that we have to work with, TDOT or TDEC or PWRA or somebody like that?
So they've been in meetings with us. They could have submitted this process at the very beginning for us to decide on.
I sense your frustration, Mr. Chair, but,
Yes.
but that's okay. And maybe that's one of the outcomes from this meeting, is that the advisory committee recommends to ETDD to put it back the other way, the way you're asked to do it.
I'm going to ask the committee for input.
I'm interested in the strategy part of this versus the recommendation header. I'm not, just personally not remembering the way the strategy versus recommendation was broken up in the original document. Can you just enlighten us on like the balance there between, well, sorry, let's step back one step in that the data that's here honestly isn't like a ton in front of each strategy and recommendation. It's pretty integrated, so I find it a little difficult to like break it apart in terms of how we're talking about it, so going back to recommendation at the end or what it is. So I'm just curious, like when you see, let's just, I don't know, choose a random page in here, but like where does the strategy section go and where does the recommendation section go? And how is that, would you envision it like having a, one thing is like 1.00 and references back to, chapter 1.00, right? And that's how you correlate the data to the strategy recommendation.
Right, let's take a look at an example. I don't know if y'all have it up or somewhere that you could look at it, but I can tell you enough about it to take an example. So the chapter that we were provided on page 5, it's got 23 pages in this PDF document. It's got a strategy. This falls under Parks and Recreation. Strategy. The Special People's Park is a prime example that should remain a priority for civic bodies and residents. Its rehabilitation and further development are essential for the community. That's a land use policy. And in this document here, the previous format, that would go in section 5 under the development plan. It would probably fall into public, semi-public, open space, and recreational land use policies on page 66. And so that's where the strategy would go. And then the second part, a recommendation, a plan, plus the procurement of a grant or philanthropic fund should be sought for its design, financing, and construction. Now that's how do you implement that. If you agree that the Special People's Park is a priority for our community, or for our city, and how do you go about doing the strategy? Well, that goes here in implementation methods, and there's a corresponding section in here that talks about how do you implement that. So that's kind of an example.
And to follow up on that example, like if you take what's difficult about this structure here is that it's not defining the header under which the strategy lives, right? It's kind of dumping all the data here and putting data as if it's all equal together, and then making assumptions based on said data without tying it to whether it's building codes or land use codes or whatever. Right. So I'll just go ahead and say and agree with the chair that there's no way for us to have a red line version of the old plan in this format, and it's been specifically asked that ETDD provide us a red line change document so that the folks who are used to working with the document that you have in front of you, and that will work in the future, that we have apples to apples to know where we've been and where we're going.
I would also like to agree with that. We did ask for a redlined option of the original document. I will say that I do like the condensed part of this. This makes it a whole lot easier to read as far as just getting a general sense. If you just wanted an overview of, what their thoughts on these different subjects would be. But as great as that is, it's not what we asked for.
And I guess I'm open to being told that what we asked for wasn't like the best version of something, but
That should have happened before now.
yeah. And I'm actually John, Mayor, excuse me. I'm curious, your opinion of how many chapters from the existing land use and transportation plan do you think are covered in this single submittal from ETD? And I think that's where I'm struggling to draw a comparison. Is where, long story short, what are we covering in these 15 pages versus however many you covered over there?
Yeah, my sense, Houston, as I look at it, is it has elements of section 4, land use, transportation, inventory, and analysis. And then it also has features of some of the all the data stuff in the current plan that sits under illustrations.
Right, okay, that's,
Yeah, so it's taken a couple of pieces, there. Well, one of the reasons I think that the planning commission asked us to update the document and not start from scratch is that this document actually has an antecedent. So people that have been on the board for a long time, or residents that follow this, having that continuity, they probably know this. Commissioner Jenkins will say, something and refer to this document. And, Don and Sandy probably know the antecedent document. But they all build on one another so you can see how you got there. So from 2010 to 2020, how do we get from 2020 to 2030 or whatever our time frame will be? So having the same format gives you that continuity that builds on what we have here rather than starting with a brand new document. And this sort of, even though, it was explained to me as a format change, it starts to look like a new document, which makes it harder to follow. If I'm one other point, if I'm a commissioner or on the planning commission, I might read one time all these chapters in the beginning, but I'm going to focus on that chapter 5 and 6, and I'm going to dog ear it, and that's where I'm going to keep going back to those chapters and reading and seeing what we need to do next. So that's why having it in that format versus having all the strategy and recommendations spread throughout, I think is probably a better working document for the planning commission and board of commissioners going forward.
yeah, I'm glad Mayor, I'm glad you brought this up. I was honestly a little lost, just starting looking at this. I couldn't tell if it was just a summary of what we were looking for, or something like a chapter they had submitted. So, well, thank you for clarifying that. And two,
Yeah, they've been providing some chapters along.
Yeah.
When I got this one, I thought, oh, this is chapter 4. No, maybe it's something else. And then I saw these strategies and recommendations. Tried. I might be off, but that's sort of the way I understand it by looking at the current document.
So that's my frustration. So it sounds like it's warranted. Sandy?
I wasn't in on how we directed East Tennessee Development District to do it, but I had a hard time comparing and kind of following and kind of coming in the middle. So I think the contingency, everything together would be better if we had it.
So I think, and seeing this document and not the past documents, I think if I'm going to be future Dave Hope 30 years from now and sitting on a committee like this, I would have in comparison previous documents, 10-year documents,
Yeah.
that are very almost laid over one another, and you can see Townsend building its changes and doing
That's right.
modifications. So a completely different format really kind of throws a loop into
Yeah.
that process.
Well, I think what you would see between this document and the new one, just to give an example, we talked a lot about how we need to address, potential for flooding. I mean, that's a recent thing. And there is some stuff on flooding here, but what you would see is in our document, you would see is a more expanded discussion about flooding and floodplains. What's not here, back in 2008, wasn't really any discussion on Airbnb or anything like that. So if we have, talking about our housing stock, you would see it, but it would be an evolution. You'd be able to pull this one off the shelf and put it next to ours and understand, how these things are changing.
In a little side note, in a conversation I had with Ida at SE Group, the Parks and Rec piece is drafted and ready.
Okay.
So they are, I think they're at the, they're where they need to be. So just to explain where we're at with SE Group is we're rounding third with them with our commitment and the contract that we have with them. So I've been postponing her input monthly to save the time and the money till East Tennessee Development District kind of catches up a little bit. I don't know what, maybe once we get back with East Tennessee Development District and maybe get a timeline. I believe we have a Gantt chart process with them and get them back to where we're at with that. Maybe then we can contact Ida and give her some kind of idea. But I think they're good right now. They're, you know, they're class
Yeah,
acts.
and I think we're early enough on still, I mean, even though we're at the end of this process and we're trying to bring it all together, we still have enough time to give them feedback before they, you know, draft an entire document along these lines, so we can give them that feedback. It would be important to give it to them timely, because, you know, it would seem like they would have a level of effort that they would have to go back and do. But I feel pretty good, because this is what we asked them to do in the beginning.
This feels like a pretty aggressive move on their part, though, to veer away from what we asked them. So,
Well,
just
you
my
know,
thoughts and opinion.
What I've come to learn in Townsend is you have a lot of goodwill, and what that means, you got a lot of people trying to help you. And everybody has their own idea of how they're gonna help us. And so I think, you know, I look at it as positive intent, but nevertheless, we have to bring it's just like any other contract, you have to bring your pieces all together at the end. So.
But speaking of contractual agreement, I do believe that, well, we haven't seen anything in place to hold a contract to them. So I still believe, regardless of whether it's goodwill and we all want to get along, this is still a contract. So
Well,
I see it as such.
yeah, I'm confident. We've worked with ETDD for a long time, and, you know, they're under contract to advise the city and so on other matters, and so I feel good they're gonna perform on their contract, but we need to give them some guidance to get them
Oh, I think we
back
will give them some
back in the
guidance.
frame, so.
So speaking of guidance and kind of how we work through the information they have in here, where do we stand as a group to like look at the recommendation or the strategy, the recommendations and that kind of stuff, and like provide feedback on the actual content of what they're doing versus just talking about the structure to do which is communicated.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why it's helpful. I mean, you can go through and provide, you know, feedback on these recommendations that you have. I suspect that some of them, after we ask them, will still translate into section 5 or section 6. And so if there's something in here that you think is not consistent with what you know, your experience, your guidance, what you heard from our city residents and all those feedback sessions, if there's someplace in there that these recommendations, we need to be building skyscrapers, then you need to flag up now and say, you know, I haven't heard this, I don't know that this is a good idea. But yeah, these are the beginnings of the recommendations that will go in there. So just like Special People's Park, we had a kickoff meeting with the consultant that we hired this week. And we talked about, you know, what's the vision for the Special People's Park. You know, there's land adjacent to that where those picnic tables are. They're in the right of way, and so we're in the process of updating our right of way agreement. And so what do we need in the Special People's Park area versus what do we need in the adjacent area? And so those are all things that would be, you know, sort of policy recommendations. And so if for some reason, you know, we've heard that people don't want that, or we don't think that's a good idea, or it has some particular flaws, now's the time to put it out on the table and, you know, discuss it, because there are other things that are interdependent with the work that's going on here. We didn't sort of freeze everything in time, but it's got to match up. So what we're doing with Special People's Park is the natural fit for what goes in the Parks and Rec master plan.
Additional oversight authority for the city, and I'm curious what, you know, as CPAC, like, there's a step that requires funding for positions like that, you know, and that's not really something for us to decide, like the actual practical implementation of how it happens, but do we take that into consideration just practically, or are we here, or is that not really our job, you know?
Well, the first job is to say, do we have all the data? And so if we had asked for additional, you know, flood maps and things like that, and I think we did, we actually talked about wildfires too, and do we have the right data set to be working on to develop the policies? The next thing is, are the policies right? And, you know, the policies can be aspirational. If, for example, one of the policies turned out to be, you need a downtown area, you need a pedestrian area, whatever you want to call it. I've heard a lot of people talk about this over time, is Townsend doesn't really have any downtown. You go to a lot of these small cities around, and over time, they have developed some downtown. We had a downtown, and I think it got largely taken down after the lumber company, removed a lot of their offices and buildings and things. But at one point, Townsend sort of had a downtown. So is there, should we try to make a downtown back? That would be an aspirational policy. If it's the right policy and you can't do it for some practical reason, like you're never going to be able to do it, then it shouldn't be a policy if it's never going to be viable. But if we all agree that it's viable, and then there has to be a path for how you do that. And so how would you create a downtown? And I put that in air quotes because we don't know what a downtown would look like. It might just be a pedestrian area where people could walk around and go to museums and shops and things like that. But, if there's some big flaw in it, either it's not the right policy or it has some limitation that it just can't ever happen, then it shouldn't be a policy. But it's okay for it to be aspirational. And then the implementation is in 2025, what is our best guess at how we can get there? Do we need to change the zoning? Do we need to develop additional funds where the city could buy up property and make it into a public area? The implementation plan doesn't have to be exactly what happens, but it has to be our best understanding of how would you implement that policy. And so you don't have to, the committee's not being asked to look into the future and say, how will it happen? But is it the right policy, and can you give us a general idea of how it would be implemented? And then it's up to the Board of Commissioners and it's up to the Planning Commission to actually take the steps to make it happen. So the Planning Commission might change zoning, the Board of Commissioners might, authorize funds to purchase something for a pedestrian area. I'm just using this as an example. I'm not saying that that's in the document at this point, but I'm just trying to answer your question. So policy can be aspirational, it just has to be somewhat feasible, and then the implementation plan doesn't have to be exactly what we follow, but while we've got our experts assembled, what's our best guess of who's in charge of actually moving that forward?
All right, one more follow-up here about recommendations. Do you think it would be helpful if this committee took the recommendations in whatever format they end up coming into this and essentially ranked them based on what we've heard, what we've gone through and such? Is that something, or does the recommendation live in a chapter and therefore it's, you don't really get to compare land use planning to building codes and ranking then what our priorities?
Yeah, one of the shortcomings of this document here, and it's a very good document, is that there's a lot of stuff in here that never got done. And the reasons, there's probably myriad reasons why some of this stuff never got done. Some of it is probably really worth still doing. And so we need to look and make sure if there's stuff that's in here that's good, and I think there is, we need to carry it forward. But I think it might be useful if you could, and this will, I don't want to slow us down, but if there is some way to prioritize it and tell the Planning Commission, hey, this is something you need to pay attention to right now. And, again, I'll come back to this issue with the housing stock. And so my guess is that a lot of the issues that we need to address with our housing stock should be done pretty soon. Because if it gets away from us, we won't have enough people that still live in Townsend. Now, I've told you, one of my biggest concerns is that we lose that balance between people that live here all the time and people that might own a vacation rental and come here occasionally, or some people, maybe increasingly, that own property and never come here. And if you lose that balance, it will be very hard to get that back. And so there are some things like that that might deserve a little more priority than other things. And I'll say another thing, so we need to be looking at future planning as well. Urban growth boundary is another thing that probably needs to be addressed with some priority, because that will necessarily impact, everything. So if you look at the bulk of Townsend's urban growth boundary, it's on the other side of the river. And I don't know exactly how that
So I think-
policy came to be, but it doesn't entirely make sense to me. And it puts us in some, I welcome some public input on this, how it came to be, but I would, it creates some liabilities, one of which we just experienced for several months, because the urban growth boundary is so tight on one side. So if there's anybody who wants to lend experience on that, I'd be interested.
Back several years ago, we spent a lot of time on the urban growth boundary. Public Chapter 1101, it had a lot of meetings in Nashville with a lot of people, the county and advisors. And the reason a lot of it, I guess, went on the other side of the river was there wasn't a whole lot of land available on the other side, our side of the river, with the boundaries, with the park and with the mountain and the terrain and so forth. So it just was logical to go there and be contiguous, everything adjoining to the city. But did they not just do away with all of that until there is nothing else available to us now? Townsend has no urban growth boundary?
No, Townsend has an urban growth boundary now. It's the same one that was put in place.
But they don't allow us to, the old law was that we could annex. But now we can't unless someone asks to be annexed.
The annexation procedure has changed, and there's a separate process for actually how you determine what your urban growth boundary is. And then once your urban growth boundary is determined, then you follow that annexation process. But that, you're right, Sandy, I think the annexation process in state law has changed. And so it's different than it used to be. But you can, and that's where my understanding, you can correct me, you can only ask to do annexation within your urban growth boundary. And so you can't annex outside your urban growth boundary, and people can't ask to be annexed if they're not in your urban growth boundary.
And you can't force it.
You can't force it. I mean, that's the process on annexation, but you can set your urban growth boundary where you think it ought to be. And that is something that ought to be in this document, is some recommendation on where we think our urban growth boundary ought to be.
Where is it in the old one, just by chance? Can you go to it?
Yeah, hang on.
It should be.
Yeah, it's in here.
That's one of the things that we didn't get a ton of direct feedback on during this process, just because we were assuming that the part of the first assumption of the work was that we were to consider all of the valley or all of the cove in this, and that made it where we didn't ask the specific question of who is in favor or what are the opinions of increasing the urban growth boundary. So how do we approach that as a committee in terms of our personal preferences versus what we may have heard from the community that was not solicited directly?
Yeah, but to answer your first question, I think it's referred to somewhere else, but around page 35, it might actually be 35, you got the map that has the urban growth boundary on there. My guess is that this would be something that DTDD would put in there. So as a draft recommendation, they would look at how many people do you have, where are your roads, where is a likely tax base, I don't know what all, it's part of the data analysis. And they would say, based on this, we think your urban growth boundary is fine, we think it needs to be expanded, we might need to contract. I mean, there's all kind of recommendations that they could make. But when I'm looking here in section 5, I'm expecting to see a recommendation on urban growth boundary. And yeah, with all due respect, it doesn't make sense to me currently where it sits on this side of the river.
And I definitely would expect to see an updated version and master plan. It's just,
Yeah,
that's where it
we
lives.
are bounded by the park,
Yeah.
but, I don't know why it wouldn't run right up to the park, for example. But, and it also makes sense to have it on the other side of the river. And my understanding is there has been, and not so many years ago, a request from a community on the other side of the river to be annexed into the city. And of course, that has to be given real serious consideration because of our revenue structure. So anytime you're annexing residential area in, you're increasing your expenses without necessarily increasing your tax base, because the business is what drives your tax base. And so you have to be able to balance that, and my guess is that's why people didn't make a decision previously to start annexing area on the other side of the river, is because it's primarily residential and it wouldn't balance with the tax base. So I don't know that to be a case, that's only my
Makes sense.
historical
Yeah.
supposition.
So speaking of, I got one more question about land that I'm not sure pops up here. I'm curious, Mayor, of your opinion of where it might. So speaking of urban growth boundary or annexing in, or just the constituents of Townsend in general, part of the things we've heard is who gets to vote, who doesn't get to vote. And it's not a topic we've really brought up, as CPAC doesn't live under land use and transportation, but at the same time, it's still like land-based, right? And so does that sort of strategy or recommendation for how we determine our voter base, our citizen base here, landowner, not landowner, permanent resident, whatever you want to call it, like, does that live in a document like this ever, or does it live in something else?
Yeah, I think, Houston, that is a side effect of what we're doing with our policies. I had somebody write to me last week, says, I'm in the city. And, people tell me I'm not in the city. Am I in the city or not in the city? And so we had to clarify, in fact, they are in the city. But the things that drive where the city limits are, I don't know that in this plan we consider like representation in there. I could be corrected, somebody could tell me that we are supposed to do that. But it's more about making sure that we are planning for the right revenue balance, the right infrastructure growth, those types of things. I mean, it's all really fundamentally comes down to, how can you provide city services, and how can you, make sure that, people forget, the city services that they get. I have people come in here and say, I get 0 city services. And I say, well, what about police? What about fire? What about that helicopter, evacuation thing? There are city services, to be obtained. So we're trying, I think, as we look at more people coming in and more businesses, how can we balance those things in a rational way so that you don't ever get out of sync? The main job is to have a plan for the future, and people love Townsend. They want to come here. They want to open businesses here. They want to live their lives here. They want to visit here. And so I think, we have to plan for that. And what we will get out of this next plan is something that makes sure that we have that balance, that it doesn't just go on willy-nilly and we get out of balance. And so that's what you've accomplished by putting it in place. Sorry, it's a long answer.
Okay, let me take some input from the committee on the chair communicating with East Tennessee Development District to send them an email in response to the discussion on the agenda number 4. Any input thereof? As the mayor points out, I might be a little harsh.
I was gonna say that might be an in-person conversation versus an email. Right?
Well, and-
Email request for a meeting.
Okay, so how does that, correct me in the protocol, Mayor, how does that,
Yeah, I
can
think,
we do that?
well, on
How
behalf
do
of,
we need them in?
Yeah, on behalf of the committee, you can reach out to the consultants like you've been doing. You can represent the feedback from the committee, and you can, summarize our discussion here. We thank them for, preparing this. We remind them that, they were asked to use the same format as in the current plan. We note that there's, a lot of interesting strategies. We generally think this ought to go in section 5. There's a lot of recommendations, probably generally ought to go in section 6. For the purpose, you could explain, for the purpose of making sure that the plan that we're developing now builds on and has continuity with this plan, we were directed by the Planning Commission to follow the current format. And we'd be happy to meet with them, to provide them with some additional examples. And we need to make sure that we're still going to be able to deliver that in the time frame.
I'd like to ask co-chair if he would attend the meeting.
Happy to do it if I'm around, Mr. Chairman.
We will work out our schedules based on there. It's always better with two.
I'm not sure. Anyway.
All right, we'll work through that. Great recommendation there. Love it.
I think that's very best, that we need to do that.
In person.
It needs to be in person, and we need to.
I love looking people in the eye, having conversations. I really get that.
Yeah, and let them know what we expected and not
Okay.
quite what we're getting. And
I just want
all
to
the
stay
time.
within the confines of the committee. I don't know where that crosses the line as far as dealing with the contractor of ours. So as long as we're good,
Yeah,
and the city's happy.
Yeah, you're fine to interact with the contractor and,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. I will make sure that the committee is completely CC'd and the mayor.
Yeah, I think this is just feedback on what they gave
Yeah.
us.
Oh, no,
That's
no, I
not-
mean-
If you run into
Yeah.
anything about the contract, then you should involve city manager
Yeah.
on that, and
Yeah.
they'll be the appropriate people to engage from a contractual standpoint. I don't-
Well, I think we have a Gantt chart
Yeah,
process anyways. Go back and we'll pick those documents up. Me and the co-chair will get our heads together to make sure that our time is very well spent there and something in some type of numerical order where we can accomplish what we need in an hour and then report back via email on our findings to the committee that
yeah.
we're back on track or not back on track. And then obviously, hopefully by next month, expect an amended version. In the meantime, I'm gonna ask the city manager you have a copy of the old version?
The old land use, yeah.
Yeah, okay, you're good. I'd like to ask for, you don't want one?
No,
You're
I have
good?
one, yeah.
Printed copy?
I've got one at my house, yes.
Okay. I'm the only one still working off electronic, but I think I'm gonna go to the printed, so I'm gonna ask Kayla if she would print me a copy and then I can make some.
Mr. Chairman, I was gonna take one step back about communicating with UTDD. And just request that you actually put it out there that we will be requesting them to go back, and like matching the format to the old format. Go ahead and put just that basic fact in writing to them so that they can go ahead and get started on it.
Okay.
And then, ask I'd love to meet with you and discuss why, off the kind of olive branch. And I say that, just knowing that we have the July 4th holiday around the corner, and if they don't get started on this restructuring, they're gonna have basically, Tuesdays, they're gonna basically have 2.5 weeks to get it done, and based on their previous timelines of turning things around, that's not enough for them to restructure this. So I feel like we need to give them that data point of, hey, we expect this, and then let's come and talk about it.
I believe we might have an initial document that laid that out with them, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we just
Just have to go back and find that. Yeah. Okay. Good point.
Yeah, the scoping document that the planning
Yeah,
commission
there you go.
developed, which is supposed to be sort of the guiding principle, so it might be useful to go back and you know.
And I believe-
Scoping document.
So when we went through you're a better memory than me, there was an actual, probably a conversation to redline, or it was in our meeting minutes, to redline a document specific for this reason, so we
Yeah,
could
it's-
follow along.
It's specifically either in November or December of our meeting minutes last year.
Okay. Okay, wow, see,
Here we are, we just finished the vision statement, I think, or the community input and started on the vision statement.
Okay. comments?
There's one other thing, Mr. Chairman, in this section that I think is probably worthwhile for the committee to think about. There are sets of recommendations in here, I think, that start to go toward workforce and worker housing. And so I think, you know, one of the things that our businesses are challenged with is, you know, workforce. And it's hard for, you know, folks to, you know, be able to commute to Townsend, and many of them might like to live here. And one of the things that we discussed a little bit about when we were talking about the proposal for Yonder, y'all might remember that there was a building there, so there's worker housing on site. And so I think, you know, being able to look at that, and this is where we can utilize our consultants to go out and see if there are best practices in some other communities that, you know, might be something that would help us here. So some of these recommendations start around page 13 on this document start to touch on that. And I think in addition to sort of the, you know, Airbnb and housing stock, worker housing is something. And, you know, if we could come up with some, you know, advanced policies or something that would help us, I think our businesses would, you know, appreciate that and maybe be able to weigh in on that.
I do think initially, in 2 points, I know one of Yonder's proposals had employee housing. I remember seeing a mock-up, probably never got submitted to the city, but at Tremont Lodge with a worker housing building. And I do know for a fact that the new owner of Vitality actually has the general manager living on site now.
Yeah, I mean,
So could be some benefit to
yeah,
that.
there's different policies that you could take. It could be encouraging, you know, actual separate physical buildings, but it could be interpreting some of our current policies to make it, you know, easier. Like in the campground, you can have an on-site manager, but he has to live in one building on a campground. And so if you looked at some of the current policies to figure out, are there ways to make them more modernized or something, it might not even be, you know, about building a separate building. It might be about taking a more flexible view towards some of our policies.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of what they're describing, or what this document's describing, is just like creating a version of affordable housing. Like they're using workforce housing as a synonym for affordable housing in some ways, and so it's. I was actually curious. This was one of my like questions about the content in here was are we using workforce housing as a synonym for affordable housing, and if so, should we be putting definitions in here of what these terminology, like what these terms are? Like, you know, they say we have hierarchical priorities, hence my question about can we state priorities in here? Workforce housing, you know, revenue capture housing, low impact tourism, enhancement of all season tourism programming. Like, I realize there's a large scale, there are different topics being talked about, but defining what each of those mean, you know, anyway, that's content that I have questions for.
So I would encourage the committee, I know we're about out of time, to think about this particular issue as well, because if we get this right, they could really help, you know, our community, you know, getting it situated where, you know, it's just something that's more positive all around. And it might also, you know, if you, in certain situations, certain policies, it might make it eligible for additional funding that, you know, that could be brought in as well to help. But it's something I think we need to think about for the future.
Yeah.
Otherwise, people continue to struggle with it and, get in non-compliant situations and nobody likes that.
Can I say something?
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Talking about your affordable housing, working, living on site and so forth. Give you some history. Basically, every motel, campground had living on site managers, owners, some 40 or 50 years ago. I mean, all the way from the upper end of town. The tilings, the wares, the styles, you don't know what I'm talking about there probably. But anyhow, all the way down to the valley, they had to live on premise, owners, managers. So, that's something I don't think you should rule out whatsoever. You should embrace that. It's just a way of life. We lived in a motel room for how many years?
15.
15 years. Yeah. Before we-
You know the exact years that you lived in a motel.
And also, Mayor, you spoke of the town center. We don't have a town center. Well, why don't you have a town center? A town center grows around usually a transportation route and a business center. Okay, if you go look back at Townsend, you had a town center in the first part of the 20th century, right? It was the lumber company for 40 years. That was the town center. Then, from outside of the little town center, it was basically farmland. Then you had a transition from the lumber company to the tourist industry. The tourist industry basically grew toward the park. There was farmland between the old city here and the tourist industry, which was set from the traffic light onto the park boundary. That's the way things evolved. So how do you make a town center? You would have to ease some restrictions to make it come together in jail, distort it, instead of urban sprawl.
Yeah. Well, it's a good point, and the question for this committee to weigh in on is that the right policy? Do we need or want a town center? A town center usually facilitates pedestrian activities and, has businesses sort of around it. And, a lot of towns sort of naturally grow that way. We had it, as you mentioned. To try to recreate it, is that something that would be worthwhile or not? And if the answer is not, well, then we go to sort of what we have now, which is basically a town with arterial flow around a bike path. And so, I've spoken about this a number of times. We've got the tunnels and, organizing and making that corridor something that allows pedestrian and increasingly e-bike and all that kind of stuff, allows people to move around Townsend and go to businesses and go to events and different things. And so it may be that we decide we don't need a town center, we just need to focus on making that corridor something that is very movable. And as people use more electric mobility stuff, whether it's a scooter or an e-bike or something, you could develop that corridor to get from one end of Townsend and be able to go to museums and restaurants and hotels and things like that. And maybe our land use policy is better spent developing something like that than trying to recreate a town center. But that's the discussion that we need to have in this body is, what's the right policy? It can be done, but at what cost and how long is time, and are you sort of fighting a trend or so?
Can I add one comment, not to
Yeah,
that, but real quick. You guys are spot on. Don't let the consultant off. And I wouldn't waste an hour. I've been a consultant, I've been on your side. Maybe it was an honest mistake, or maybe it benefited them, but send an email like Houston said. That's what, if I was on the other side, that's what I would expect. Just a simple email. Hey, and if they have an issue, they can call you, but don't let them off. Make them do what you ask them to, because that, all the reasons you say just makes the most sense. I've read that, and I would, gosh, if I got something new, it'd be very difficult to compare. So you guys are spot on.
I would like to ask, since the mayor is here, and I have some questions in regards to the committee, the makeup of the committee. We've had several absent over several months. And I would like to direct that to your attention and wondering if we're going to be making some modifications, whether they're deletions, submissions, or additions.
Yeah, and I would say go back and check the bylaws for the committee. And sometimes in the bylaws says if members have missed like 3 times in a row, then you do something. I'm not sure that that's in the bylaws for this committee. But it would be a good thing, I think, for the chair, vice chair, to reach out to these folks and say, you know, are you still interested, able to devote the time? We've noticed you've been gone twice in a row, 3 times in a row. And if you're not able to, you know, commit the time, then that's, we totally understand, and we thank you for your service up until then, but we need to get, you know, somebody else on here. And as we are probably starting to, you know, hopefully wrap things up, and we only have, you know, half a dozen or less meetings to go. We need to be thinking about, you know, how many people do you need to get the job done, to get the work done, versus how long will it take to get somebody up to speed. So there's probably something there. But you know, some people have moved away. I mean, clearly, you know, they're not coming back. But if there's somebody that's been involved and maybe they just sort of gotten busy in the summer, it's a busy time out there, you know, maybe they would want to come back with a little encouragement. But you're raising a good point, and I would just say be active about those folks, and, you know, if they want to.
I don't want to not have meetings because we can't have a quorum.
No, and it's very important going into this last stage
Yes,
that we
absolutely.
have folks that can do work, because once you get that document that you're asking for ETDD, it's going to be a lot of work, and my guess is there will be some division of labor. You look at this chapter, I'll look at this chapter, we'll all come together, present our findings, and because it might not be, you know, feasible to get all that work done in the amount of time you got left.
We did lay all that out in the bylaws before we got started of how many meetings you could miss and how many members that the committee should consist of. So I think if we go back to that document, we should find all that information.
Follow the bylaws to the
Yeah,
greatest
absolutely.
extent.
Was that, did it give a specific number? Do you
It did.
remember? I don't have it on me.
I think it was 8.
8 meetings?
No, 8 people on the committee.
Oh, 8 people. Oh, the number of the committee.
Yes.
All right, we will open up for the good of community. Anybody, any last comments from the committee itself? Any open comments randomly, left field, right field? Any more comments? Don, you have anything else?
Well, I was going to say, when I got out of high school, I went to Gatlinburg to work, and they hired a lot of young people up there, and they had a dormitory at the major hotel that I worked at. So they had on-site housing even back then.
Oh, sure. Yes.
All hearts and minds clear. Do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
I'll make the motion.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Meeting adjourned.